because if you choose plants that don't need frequent dividing, then you don't have to divide your plants. If you choose plants that don't get, really tall, or you choose plants that aren't, maybe are tall but are very sturdy, you won't need to stake plants. So things like dividing and staking can be nuts to do. There are things that you don't necessarily have to do if you've chosen the right plants. You probably have some plants in your garden right now that do need dividing, and I'm a proponent of doing it in the spring. You can also do it in the fall. Here on the Cape, I think that spring makes a lot of sense because in the fall, our gardens still look pretty darn nice, right? And our gardens usually look nice through October because we don't get a hard frost until late October or early November. And so most of us don't want to get in there and start mucking around in the gardens in September. And yet if you're going to save your dividing for the fall, September is the time to do it. Because if you do it in September, that plant still has the rest of September, October, and November to get its roots established again before the really cold of winter hits. So I think here on the Cape it makes sense for us to do that dividing in the spring. And it's not too late now. I've been out transplanting and dividing in my own garden. My garden happens to be only 3 years old. We're entering our 4th growing season on that property. But I've already discovered that many plants I put in the wrong place and they have to be moved. And so this is the time of year for moving those plants that you put in the wrong place, the ones that are getting too tall and they're in the front or whatever. And that can be a nice to do and a necessary to do is rearranging plants and dividing them. You know a plant needs dividing if it's got a hole in the middle. I'll get you in just a second. You know it needs dividing if it's starting to look out of proportion to the other plants in your garden. If you've got a patch of Siberian iris this big around, right, it probably needs dividing. And how you want to do that is you want to just stick the shovel either right into the clump and cut off pieces, but you definitely want to take the whole thing out. You don't want to just chip away at it and leave the main plant. And the reason you don't want to do that is because the parts that you want in your garden to put back are the outermost growth, which is the newest and most vital. So what you want to do is dig up that whole clump of perennials, whether you need to do it in pieces or whether you can do it all at once. Chop off some pieces from the outer edge that are about the size of a luncheon plate. Put those back in the garden and either give the rest away or throw the rest away, all right? And just keep in mind that if you have a plant that grows quickly and that needs frequent dividing, every piece that you put back in your garden is going to need attention in 3 to 4 years, okay? So it's a make-work project for you to save them all. So you may want to, give some of those to plant sales or your neighbor or whatever. You won't have to do that work if you choose the right plants. And I want to talk a little bit about some plants, some great plants, what they're good for, plants that don't need attention, and some plants that maybe need a little attention and what you can do with them. At this time of year in my garden, the plants that are absolutely stunning right now are the heuchras, right? I mean, look, you have this going in your garden, and you have beautiful color already. You have beautiful color from April until November in your garden. And there are heuchras available with lime green foliage and variegated foliage and dark purple foliage. And yes, they flower, but the flowering is almost beside the point. These plants will make any perennial garden come alive. They just come alive. And they are so beautiful in the springtime. You have this with your pink tulips or your yellow daffodils. And your garden is stunning from the get-go, even before these things start to flower. These are low-maintenance plants. They do not tend to spread. They do not tend to self-seed. They look great before and after bloom. Many of them have now longer periods of flowering. The flowers are great as cut flowers. They have everything to recommend them. Now, you had a question, and then we'll take your question.
When you're dividing it, does a plant then still produce flowers, or does it go to shock, or?
Oh, she asked, when you divide a plant in the spring, does it still produce flowers or does it go into shock? Most perennial plants will still produce flowers that season. What you will find, maybe very, very early bloomers, like those Siberian iris, you might want to wait and divide them immediately after they flower, okay? So that you get the flowering. Most plants, if you transplant them or you divide them, will be a little shorter the first year because they don't have the established root system to reach their full height. Now this can be a trick that you can use if you have a plant that you like, the perennial plant that you like, the location it's in, but it gets, you know, a foot too tall or whatever. You can use this by just going out every spring, popping it out of the soil, putting it right back in the same place, and that plant will automatically be about a third shorter that summer. So you can use that, you know, so root pruning is what it is, to keep a plant shorter if you need to manipulate its height. But most of them will go on, and it's amazing how fast they recover. Now, who had a question back there?
The name of the perennial you were just talking about?
This is heuchera, and let's see if I can find the spelling here. How do you spell H-E-U-C-H-E-R-A?
Okay.
Yeah, you know, H-E-U-C-H-E-R-A. In botanic names, CH is always pronounced as a K. So, heuchera. And as I say, it comes in many, many foliage colors, and you really can't go wrong with these plants. And it does well in part shade or part sun. What's the difference between part shade and part sun, you might ask, right? Is the glass half empty or is it half full? Well, part sun is when an area that's getting about 4 hours of direct sun that include the noon hour. That's part sun. The noon hour is when the sun is the strongest. So part shade is that same 4 hours of sun, but at either end of the day. So 4 hours of morning sun, 4 hours of late afternoon sun, 2 hours in the early morning, a couple hours late afternoon, you know, that would be part shade. Heucheras probably don't do that well in deep, deep shade. They do fine in dappled sunlight through trees. That would be fine. That would be considered a part shade situation, okay? And many of them actually do quite well in full sun as well. I have several heucheras that are planted in full sun and they do quite well. And this is a plant, I would classify this as a low maintenance plant, but it does need some attention right after it finishes with its first flush of bloom. And this one happens to be Walker's Low. Don't be fooled, Walker is not so low. Walker's Low in the garden will get about this tall. So, it's a fair-sized plant. Six Hills Giant is another variety. Dropmore is another variety of Nepeta. They are all nice, long-blooming plants. And the key to having these look great in the garden is after they finish with their first flush of flowers. They bloom in May and June. If it were sunny out, they would probably already be in bloom, but they're a little delayed. After they start to slow down a little with that first flush of flowers, you take either a pair of hedge clippers or scissors or pruners or a battery-operated shearing tool, that's what I use, and you just shear about a third to a half of this plant right off the top. And you kind of sculpt it into a little ball as if you're shaving a boxwood or something, right? The plant responds by putting out a lot more foliage and making this lovely, tidy, gray-green ball of foliage, and then it proceeds to put out more flowers. And so you have this nice-looking plant that it's a little, smaller and more contained and neater looking for the rest of the summer. And once again, look at this foliage combination. You put that purple together with this gray-blue foliage. This is a winning look in a garden, whether anything is in bloom or not. So all of the Nepidas are great plants. Let me talk about this plant. I have a love-hate relationship with this plant. This is Penstemon Husker's Red. The love part is at this time of year when it's got this beautiful purple foliage on it, right? That's, again, foliage colors and acid in the garden. It also has very pretty pink flowers that make great cut flowers. So that's the love part of this plant. The hate part is after it finishes blooming, it looks like a dog. So, in fact, my dog looks better. But I picked up this plant not to badmouth it. I think it's a perfectly nice plant, but to illustrate that when a perennial plant is no longer a visual asset in the garden, you want to cut it right to the ground. So your Shasta daisies that look ratty after they finish bloom, cut them right to the ground. Your coreopsis that looks terrible, and yeah, you could meticulously deadhead it with manicure scissors, but my friend Stephanie Cohen says that you can either deadhead your moonbeam coreopsis or you can have a life. One or the other. Not both. So that moonbeam coreopsis that you don't want to deadhead, you know, and this plant that doesn't look so great, and those Shasta daisies that don't look great, don't be afraid to cut them right to the ground. What you will leave is this basal foliage, the base foliage, and that continues to produce energy for the plant. Sometimes plants will put out some new foliage that looks very nice in the garden for the rest of the season. Occasionally a plant like the blue salvia, the salvia that's coming into bloom right now, that's another one. You know, you can kind of tweak away at deadheading it, but it never looks great. Cut it right back, and it comes back and it blooms again in August. So if a perennial plant isn't, you know, doing the job in the garden, don't be afraid to hack it back. Now the only exception to that is a woody plant like lavender or Russian sage. You don't want to cut those all the way back, because with a lavender in particular, the plant, you know, responds by saying, "This is the thanks I get, so long." And I have killed several lavenders that way. So you don't want to do it with a woody plant. But any herbaceous perennial that dies to the ground in the winter and comes back in the spring can be chopped back at any point during the season, and it improves the look of your garden. And sometimes what I'll do is for a plant, for instance, like the old-fashioned bleeding heart that I love, that plant starts to get yellow about the 4th of July, right? And at that point, I just cut it off, and then I plant some annuals around it. You know, I come into the garden center and get some nice coleus or whatever they have that looks good, and you plant them around that plant that's gone dormant, and then you add more color to the garden, and you have something going on in that spot, and it doesn't disturb the perennial that's there.